Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Peace Week event organized by the Carter School. Today, we are continuing our week-long conversation on building peace in partnership with Dr. Melissa Sinclair, who is hosting this event entitled Tracking the Human Nervous System for Sustainable Partnership Development. Before I turn it over to Melissa, I'd like to encourage you all to visit the Carter School's website to learn more about Peace Week events today and tomorrow. And I'd like to extend a special invitation for you to join us in person this afternoon from 3:30 to 5:30 for our International Day celebration held at Mason Square Plaza in Arlington. This session is being recorded. If you would like to ask a question without appearing in the video, please feel free to send it to me in the chat. And so now I will turn it over to Melissa to introduce herself and begin the session.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you today. I would love to invite you, and there's no pressure, but if you're comfortable turning your screen on, it's a lot more fun to be able to see faces and to interact together that way. And if you're uncomfortable doing so, that is fine also. But thank you for being here. And thanks, Paul, for hosting and for the introduction. So my name is Melissa Sinclair, and I completed my PhD at the Carter School. I think that was 2 names ago. I think we were the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution way back in 2019. And I'm currently an adjunct across the river at American University in their online program. I live in Boston at the moment. And for the last 18 months, I have been on a journey with an incredible group of trauma therapists who have been responding to the war in Ukraine and its effects, particularly throughout Europe. I've done a deep dive into an approach to trauma therapy called somatic experiencing that was developed by Dr. Peter Levine in the 1970s. And so much of what I will be sharing today lies at the intersection of 20 years of working in conflict work and peace and conflict studies, and this new intersection with the information that's coming out of the world of neurobiology and trauma therapy. I'm about halfway through a 3-year training to become a trauma therapist. So I'm really excited for the chance to share some of these insights with you today, focusing on how I think it can help us build more sustainable, equitable partnerships around the world, and really curious to see what you think of all of this. We've got some interactive exercises built throughout today's presentation, so you'll be invited to unmute and participate verbally or to share things in the chat. And again, if you feel comfortable turning your camera on, I'd love to see your beautiful faces. And I'm just going to turn this off. Okay. So here's my story to set the stage for this presentation today. After about 20 years of working in the field of peace and conflict studies, well, after about 15 years of it, so 2 years in Afghanistan with USAID and a few years back at the headquarters here, 2 years in Kosovo, immediately following that war with an NGO, too many years with the US government doing foreign policy work in DC. I moved to Pittsburgh to marry this guy that I had fallen in love with while working in Afghanistan. He was going to med school there. And the long story made short is that our then 6-month-old child had a very traumatic medical experience. And in trying to help my child in the aftermath of that experience, I stumbled upon a book by Peter Levine called Trauma Through the Eyes of a Child. And it was incredible. The book helped me not only understand what was happening with this little baby's body, this pre-verbal child that didn't have the words to tell me what was happening, but the bodily cues were so clear. It also made a little crack in my own heart and mind, body, being, where I began to realize that a lot of the things that I was struggling with were actually linked to dysregulation in my own nervous system. And I began a journey 5 years ago. I had this realization of I'm not a person at peace. And here I am as someone who, supposedly a peace builder, has gone all around the world doing this peace building work, but I'm not a person who internally feels at peace, and I don't know what to do about it. And I've got a PhD in this, and I don't know what to do about it. And in fact, I love our program. I'm so grateful for the experience there. But the tools that I needed to heal and to be able to become the person I want to be in the world. And now it's changing the type of work I want to do, weren't available to me in the field of peace and conflict studies. It's in the intersection. I love that we're an interdisciplinary field. It's in the intersection for me now between this and what's coming out of neurobiology, and especially as held and processed within the trauma community. So I'm really grateful to be able to sit at this intersection between these two fields right now. I was hired a week after the escalation of the war in Ukraine to support an incredible group of trauma therapists who were mobilizing to respond to what was happening in Ukraine, but then also as refugees flooded across Europe. So there's a wonderful training institute where Peter Levine's knowledge is kind of passed around the world called Somatic Experiencing International. They're headquartered in Boulder, Colorado. And they hired me. Their therapists are incredible at what they do, but this particular group, number one, had never mobilized for a mass response before, and they weren't necessarily well-versed in applying this to our field, to conflict zones and all of the specific issues that arise when working in conflict fields, like conflict-based, sexual CRSV, the conflict-related sexual violence, or the loss of limbs, or things that if you've been working in conflict zones are very familiar to you, but for these therapists were new issues to be addressing. And so they hired me to just help organize that response. And it was an incredible experience. For a year, I was working with them. I began my trauma training with them halfway through that year. And that's the context in which many of the stories that I'll share today are coming from. One of the things that was so eye-opening for me is that trauma is something that I always thought about in relationship to, I served for 2 years in Afghanistan. So if someone had a single incident that was a traumatic event, like maybe an IED blast, it made a lot of sense that they then would eventually be diagnosed with PTSD. I didn't know that 15 years of being in the DC grind can have the same effect on your nervous system. Chronic stress has the same effect on your nervous system as a single incident event. I had no idea. And so the signs that I was seeing in my own body of a complex PTSD diagnosis that was undiagnosed, I would never have picked up on. And I find this really fascinating. And I think that it's probably very common because we are part of, and especially for those of you that are dialing from DC, that are dialing in from active conflict zones around the world, we've normalized a lot of the behaviors, I think, that are actually trying to cue us into something's off here. But it's been accepted and normalized within our industry. So sometimes it's hard actually to stop and to listen. So I hope that today's conversation is also inspirational in that we are better equipped to look at ourselves and to listen to the cues coming up from our bodies and to be able to interact with others whose responses to our work with them in these partnerships often gets labeled as that person's problematic, or they're so difficult to work with, or frustration around things not going the way that we hope that they will, when really we're often dealing with deeply traumatized people. So the more that we learn about this field, I think the better equipped we will be as peace builders. So my new mantra that I'm going to outline for you what it is that today's session is about and the takeaways from it. And then we'll get into some story sharing and some exchange. But my new mantra is peace from the inside out. I am on a journey to try to figure out how I can be a person at peace. And my hope is that once I'm a person at peace, that peace will then extend to my relationships. And I don't think I fix it and then it extends. I think it's something that I build in relationship with those who are closest to me, with my neighborhood, with my community, with my nation, by which I mean the broad people groups that I identify with around the world, and then hopefully the whole world. I think peace from the inside out is the only way for me now. So that's what I'm working on these days. What I would like to do, the other thing I wanted to say is I'm just so thrilled to see mental health on the agenda here this week too, Paul, and several peppered throughout in several locations. And I think we're at a prime moment to have these conversations, which is really exciting for me. So what I'd like to do today is to build on all these conversations that are happening in our field around mental health that are happening here at Peace Week, and specifically focus on what we know about the human nervous system and how it operates, and what the trauma world and the field of neurobiology is discovering specifically about the autonomic nervous system, that is the involuntary and reflexive functions of the human body and the wisdom that lies therein, and then how that can apply to our efforts to build relationship with other and to build partnerships around projects, etc. So my hope is that by the end of the session, you'll be able to identify patterns of nervous system activation and settling, and then through this be better to be able to understand how to better build partnerships, because I think that it's through this approach we can best utilize the skills that are so important that are taught in our field around deep listening, around getting beyond positions and interests to the true needs of what's happening in a situation, in a person's body, in an organizational body. Organizations carry trauma too. So my hope is that you'll feel better equipped to begin playing in this space by the end of the session. Does that sound good? Okay, thanks for being here. So I've got some slides and then we'll go back to conversation. So Peter Levine, let me make this big. Peter Levine's big aha moment in the 1970s came from his observation of animals in the wild. And if you've heard this before, please forgive me, but we'll just go quickly to set a baseline of understanding to get us all on the same page. If you've read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, if you've seen any of Gabor Mate's YouTube videos or other events that he's done, this is all in a very similar vein. So Peter's big aha moment came from observing animals in the wild. If you think of a deer, this is, what is this animal? I wrote it down. It's a bongo because I made these slides when I was presenting in Sierra Leone, and that's one of the versions of a deer that they have there. It's very interesting because we share the same nervous system. The basis of our nervous systems are the same throughout the animal kingdom. And when animals are grazing or having sex or taking a nap in the wild, if your cat at home, your dogs, you'll see the same. They're grazing peacefully, their system's at rest, but they're always alert, noticing what's around. Our systems do this too, but we're not as aware of it, always noticing what's happening in the environment. And as soon as a stimulus comes in that indicates potential threat or opportunity, oh, what was that noise? Is it a lion? Or, a potential mate. Then they'll have a charge. There's a charge in their system that alerts them and wakes up their system. If the animal assesses the situation and decides that the threat is not really a threat, then they'll just go back to grazing and staying somewhat alert. If the animal thinks that this is a very serious threat, then the system will make one of three choices primarily, right? I need to turn off my WhatsApp so that doesn't keep happening. I'm sorry. The animal may mobilize its energy. It will mobilize energy to either, and you all know this, the 3 F's, right? To stand its ground and fight, to flee from the situation, or to freeze. Freeze actually takes the most amount of energy for an animal to lay there and to pretend to be dead, to drop the heart rate such that it's not registering. It takes a lot of energy to contain all of that. In the human body, psychologists, sociologists are now talking about a 4th category called fawn, which often happens in long-term abusive relationships or systemic injustice. You can see this happening too, where the entire system will go into what Judith Herman, who's a wonderful psychologist here in Boston at Harvard, calls the universal sign of, I'm looking for her book because I just had it, but I think I moved it. It's on the cover of her book, where the whole system just kind of goes down into a an appeasement mode to appease the aggressor. So you'll see a posture of submission come in, where the head goes down, the shoulders slump, and a submissive stance is adopted for survival tactics. I think it's incredibly sad, incredibly telling that Black and brown children around the United States are taught as a survival mechanism. They have to be taught to adopt this very submissive stance when encountering structures of power. And it's a survival mechanism. So there's these 3 F's that our system will naturally go into. And the really interesting thing about this is that the responses are, except for perhaps the fawn one, which is a more conscious one, but these 3 F's that I first mentioned, fight, flight, freeze, these are autonomic nervous responses. They are automatic. They are beyond our ability to control. And they look like the following. You might have heard of Paul MacLean's triune brain, which was developed in the 1960s, and neuroscientists actually are not a big fan of this these days because there's much about this oversimplified model that we now know is incorrect, but it remains popular thinking because it's a really nice way to just kind of explain the different parts of the brain and how they work together. And I'm going to stop screen share just for a moment so that I can connect with all of you. Although I don't think anybody's turned their screens on for me yet, but you can use your hand to think about this actually. So you've got the oldest part of our brain, the reptilian brain, that's responsible for the heartbeat, breathing, circulation, body temperature, etc. And I'm sure many of you already know this. You've got inside the limbic part of the brain, we can think about kind of being here, which is hosting our emotions, and it's constantly scanning the environment. And from very, very, very early in childhood, especially in social creatures like humans or other social animals, looking for patterns to help us understand what keeps us safe. What are the patterns of how we stay safe? What are the patterns of things to avoid? It's attached to memory, etc. And then this part of the brain that is so crucial for humans, for many animals, but for humans, it is so developed, the neocortex. All animals have this neocortex, but in humans, it's much thicker and much more developed than in any other mammal. It also can be our Achilles heel, right? The strength can lead to our downfall because, as you've heard said many times, we get stuck in our thinking. And humans have this incredible capacity where we override actually the cues that are coming up from our body, and we learn over time to rely more on our thinking than on the information coming up from our system. Being the mother of a 5-year-old has been a fascinating experience in many, many ways. But I see Paul doing north-south right now, and I'm sure with your own kids, you've noticed this, right? Because when you become a parent or a caregiver, when you have, small children that you're close to, you get swept back into a time period before the neocortex was so strong. And to watch my child's natural reactions to situations be able to manifest without social cues having tamped them down is fascinating. It's just fascinating. And we began a little social experiment in our house where when he was having a reaction to something at the dinner table, maybe he didn't want to sit still or eat his peas or whatever, and he would have a reaction and you would know it. We thought, what if we didn't say no, 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 and try to tamp that down? Obviously, he needs to learn how to behave in our social settings in this world. It's not that. But what if we honored what was coming up in his body at that moment? And so we taught him, buddy, if you're upset, you have the option. You can get up and go to your room until you cool off and then come back and finish eating with us. Or you can stay here with us, but you've got to calm down if you want to stay with us. We're not going to have a tantrum at the table. And he would get up and go, and he would come back a few minutes later after he cooled off, or maybe he'd be in there for a little while. And I thought maybe he needs a hug. Maybe he needs a little social engagement. So I'd go in and just connect with him, and then he would come back. And it's amazing to me how supportive it was for him to be able to fully express what was coming up for him and to let those cycles pass all the way through his body and then to rejoin. And over time, he's 5 now. I don't have some wild child that's out of control. I have a kid that we work together and we've structured, an understanding with our family, with our friends group, that we're not going to shut down what we see happening with him. We're going to help socialize him over time, but we're going to try to honor what it is that's coming up in his system. And I thought I might be setting myself up for abuse by him of this too, but it's been really interesting for me to watch. So my only point with this is to say that I think often in children we can see this most clearly. So what if we were able to tune back into the information that's coming into our system from below the neck? What if we stopped for a moment overriding all of that information by what we think we should be doing, by what society tells us is the right thing to do, and by all the social patterns, all the socialization that has happened? My child, you learn, as you all know, you learn racism, you learn to buy into structural biases in your system, in the systems that you're raised in, consciously or unconsciously. And it's really fascinating to go back in time and to see before that stuff develops. So I think it can be our Achilles heel, and that we become very dependent on our thoughts about what's happening, and we stop listening to other equally important, often if not more important, information that's coming up from our bodies. So let me return briefly to my PowerPoint, and then we'll do a little exercise. So this was just, I make this big for you. This was just the brain, and there's these 3 parts, like we said. And the interesting thing about these responses, again, is that they're automatic, and they're beyond your ability to control, and they're immediate. So your brain in microseconds will make connections, and your body will respond accordingly. So in the animal kingdom, a healthy nervous system, and you'll see this, for example, in the deer that I was just sharing, they have this type of a wave pattern. We all have this type of a wave pattern: a charge, a discharge. My kid gets upset, it quickly dissipates with him once I support it. It's incredible. The deer senses a potential threat, the threat passes, and its system goes back to resting. It's amazing in the animal kingdom too, with the deer, for example, to watch how even in the most extreme threats, perhaps it has had to flee from a lion. Once it gets back to a place of relative safety, and it has escaped that threat, and the lion is no longer there, the deer will just go back to grazing peacefully. But often in the human system, we get stuck. Our systems are unable to go back to resting peacefully. And Peter Levine posited that one of the reasons for this is because the charge that is created through that very natural response to a situation isn't able to fully process through our bodies. And we don't have time to get into his particular therapeutic approaches, but it's very interesting because you'll watch him work in sessions with people. I was watching a session where he was working with a veteran from Iraq who had traumatic brain injury. He had been in an IED blast. He had seen a lot of terrible things happen to his teammates. And he had tics where his face and his jaw were shaking uncontrollably. And as Peter worked with him to just let your body feel what is happening with all of this, and sensed into it, and worked very slowly together with that over a few sessions, that charge that was stuck in his body and unable to fully process, space was created. Peter did a lot of really small movements with the jaw. He used a pillow and let the veteran push on the pillow and imagine things that he was not able to fully complete while there. And you saw the charge dissipate, and the tics are now gone. And there's a beautiful video that I'm happy to share with you online that captures their working together over this. So his insight was that there are these charges, these discharges, and that often, and that sometimes in the human body, the charge is not able to fully discharge. It gets stuck in our body, and we see the effects of that. So trauma, in the approach that I have adopted, is very specifically anytime that your nervous system has an overwhelming experience, and your body isn't able to fully process whatever that experience was, and it is somehow stuck in your body. This is what produces this category, this label that we've now come up with, trauma. And I am coming to believe that it can be addressed, that all of this is able to be resolved. And it's very interesting because it also helps us understand why trauma is not in the event. It's in your body's reaction to the event. So Paul and I might witness or be a part of the same incident, but it can register in my body very differently than in his. And so I might walk away traumatized by it, or 6 months or 3 years later, realize that I'm carrying the charge from that still in my body. And Paul might actually be fine. His body might have metabolized it for different reasons, for whatever we brought to that situation and just however it hit us at the time. So trauma is not in events. It's in the way that our body is processing events. So cycles of activation, settling, activation, settling. I'd like to do an exercise now and invite you to join me in this. Paul, I don't know if you want to do this with me too, but if you can, I'm going to unplug my headphones, stand up. Maybe you can find an adaptation at your seat if you don't want to do this, but you can stand up wherever you are. Got a chair in my way, and just lean all of your weight onto one foot. And feel your foot on the ground, put all of your weight there. Notice the flatness of your foot against the ground. Notice the posture of your body. You can lean all the way over if you want. Maybe your right arm, I'm putting on my right leg. Your right arm is heavy on that side. And just notice your body in space. And now I want you to do the opposite, left. Do the left. Notice your left foot on the floor. The leaning of your body, my shoulder pulling down, my head is pulling down, my knee is shaking because I need to work out more. I'm moving up and down on my ankle. Notice what that feels like in your system. And now what I want you to do is to hop back and forth for a minute. Put all the weight on the right, all the weight on the left. Maybe you can turn around a little bit. Maybe you can raise your arms a bit while you're doing it. Wiggle your shoulders around a little bit. It feels good to move. Hop back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for just a moment, and then sit back down. And my question to you is, what do you notice in your body now that you're sitting down again? Notice. Paul, you're welcome to unmute. I don't know if folks will talk, and you're welcome, everyone, to use the chat box too. What do you notice in your system after doing that? More relaxed. Is anyone? Yeah, your whole system's more relaxed, eased up. Yeah, Paul, what were you going to say?
Oh, just missing the movement. Didn't want to sit back down.
We were jumping through the whole session. Did anybody notice your heart rate go up as you were jumping because you're so out of shape like me? Yeah, it went up. It's still morning, so it's a nice habit to get into. Yeah. And now maybe you notice your heart rate's going back down a little bit. I feel thirsty. My mouth got dry when I was jumping around. Any other responses? If you hear my husband's computer dinging, I apologize. I don't know how to turn it off. Okay, so now let's just talk very briefly as a teaching tool about what neurobiologists would tell us is just happening in our bodies as we did that, okay? So we just talked about a little bit of a charge. We jumped up and down to bring a little bit of a charge into our system, right? And now as you sit back down and you feel your heart rate coming back down, there's a discharge that you're experiencing. So the human nervous system is comprised of the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord. And what I'm interested in is the peripheral nervous system, and very specifically, the purple areas on this picture, the autonomic nervous system. That is this automatic, beyond our ability to control system. Super interesting. And it's got two branches to it, as you can see there, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. And many of you might already be familiar with this language. So the sympathetic nervous system is the one that when the deer senses threat, there's a sympathetic charge. It gives energy to the system, and you see physiological changes in the system. You just experienced some of them. An accelerated heartbeat, your breathing may go shallow. That deer, his pupils would have dilated, the inhibition of the flow of saliva, all these different things. These are sympathetic system responses. Chemicals are released to give our body the energy that we need to fight, flight, or freeze. The opposite of that, this is sometimes called, the gas. It's like the gas pedal in the car. The opposite of that is the parasympathetic nervous system. It's like the brake in a car. Sometimes it's called the rest and digest system. And as you sat back down, you feel your heart rate starting to go back to normal. You feel your breathing regulate again. Your pupils will go back to a normal stance, etc. All of this is set up so that we have the energy that we need to surge in the moments that we might need it to keep ourselves safe. Which I think is really fascinating. And again, all of this is beyond your ability to control. So here's my question to you. When is the last time that you were in a meeting and you got out of your head and into your body to track these types of sensations? And I'm going to put the chat back on so I can watch if you have any responses to what I'm asking. But when is the last time that you got out of your head and into your body to track this type of information? Oh, I'm feeling a knot here in my stomach as this person's talking. I wonder what that's about. Oh, I feel myself like leaning in or sitting back and taking like a deep breath. A deep breath is a parasympathetic response that your system is like settling, resting, digesting, feeling safe. I wonder what that's about. Let me give an example of when this became crystal clear for me and see if it resonates with you at all. I was in a meeting about 6 months into working with all these trauma folks, and I had Paul, were you going to answer? I saw you on mute.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Okay. I was in a meeting about 6 months in, and I had just begun my training and all of this, and I'm immersed with all these people that think in these ways, which is super fun. I was in a meeting. I was asked by the Institute to increase my hours. I'd been hired to help organize this response to what they were doing in Ukraine, and I was asked to increase my hours to add an extra portfolio to it that I was super, super excited about. And yeah, and there was someone who was kind of in charge of this portfolio, but they wanted somebody on staff. He was a volunteer. They wanted somebody on staff to support this person. And I said, great. I was really excited. And we had a couple of initial meetings and they went really well. And the director of the Institute had asked me, how are things going? And I said, great. And they said, because some people, is everything okay? And I said, yeah, it's great. I mean, this person has a really strong personality, but I love that. I worked with the military for many, many years, and I really respond well. Like I love working with these types of people. I can, this person is direct and clear, but I feel connected, and there's a lot of interesting ideas flowing. I feel really great. And I could see that everybody was relieved by this. There was a bit of a reputation that preceded working with this person and with this guy. We'll just name it was a man. And so anyway, things were going fine until we actually started to get to the stage where we got past the get to know you stuff, and we had to actually plan and do things. And those meetings were extremely difficult. And it's difficult for me even now to tell you exactly why. And to be honest, I lost interest in my thoughts about the situation. What I noticed, and it repeated over 2 or 3 meetings, was that during these meetings, my heart was beating in my throat. It was beating so hard, it was coming up into my throat. I could feel my face flushing, but I wasn't embarrassed, but I could just feel heat surging through my body. I was frustrated. I knew that, but I know how to control these types of emotions. There was a lot of activation happening in my system whenever I met with this person, and we would spend 90 minutes simply making an agenda for a meeting, which they had never had meeting agendas before, apparently. And I was requesting that we would do them to send them out in advance. And it was so hard to even make a meeting agenda that I thought, oh my goodness, how's this going to work? Shortly into working together, the senior person in the organization, I was really struggling. And I think she knew, I don't know if I reached out or she reached out, and she said, let's talk. And she asked how things were going. And I felt very safe. And I was part of a lexicon that understands this nervous system language. And it was interesting because what I chose to report to her was, I can share my thoughts with you, but I want to tell you what's happening in my body when I'm meeting with him. It's these things that I just described to all of you. And I don't know what to make of that, because I am not a sheep. I'm not a shy person. Like, I did 2 years in Afghanistan. I thrive in aggressive environments, actually, oddly. It's not that. I don't feel safe. And the reason I know I don't feel safe is because my heart is beating so fast, my face is flushed, and I don't cognitively completely understand what's happening. I can tell you my ideas about how maybe we could address it, but I don't know what to do with this. And she held space for that and honored it in such a beautiful way. And it was so interesting because she's very close friends with him, but she listened to me. And she aligned with me on the information coming from your body is important. And if that's how you feel, those aren't safe meetings for you to be in. That's not safe spaces. Either we change the environment so you feel safe, or we figure out, what else we're going to do to support this portfolio. But that's really important information. I'd never had anybody support me in that way, but I'd never had the language to describe, and for it to be accepted as credible, not just like alongside my thoughts on what might be producing this and what we could do about it. She and I talked twice, and we came up with strategies of how to approach it. And it turned out that none of the strategy, like, it just never really got followed through on well. It required others kind of stepping in, and it didn't. And we very consciously decided to just kind of let my support for that particular portfolio fizzle. And I feel okay about that, because I know that if I had stayed in that space and tried to charge ahead and override what was coming up, it wouldn't have produced any type of sustainable results and anything that was helping to promote peace or trauma healing in the world. So my first thing that I wanted to share with you from that example is, it was fascinating to me to have that somatic information be able to be brought into a decision-making process. It was huge, and it was so instructive, and it helped us stop spinning our wheels in an area that wasn't going to get better, and to pivot. And there's nobody supporting that portfolio to this day, sadly, because systemically things need to change, and who's involved if it's going to happen. Let me pause for just a moment and look at the chat, or if you want to unmute, and just ask, how does a story like that sit with you? And do you think that this type of an approach is possible in the spaces where we work today? Do you think that we could bring somatic knowledge into our decision-making processes and into our partnerships? And are you already doing this?
Well, my first reaction, Melissa, is in that wonderful story you told is, two components: that you had the language and the ability to understand what was happening and be able to communicate it, but you also had someone who was receptive to that. And I was just thinking, I mean, that's the critical part, is if you don't have both, it can go wrong, bringing up issues like that.
Yeah.
And just thinking about the, adding on top of that layers of different experiences based on race and power, that what could cause a reaction in one person might not be understood at all by someone else.
That's a really important issue. And for me too, Paul, that's bringing up, I am really on a soapbox about in power in cultures and settings that are built around power structures. DC is a very power city, right? It's a very power-based city. Bringing up emotions or feelings is really frowned upon, and you're seen as weak when you do so. And women have been labeled in this way for trying, to bring this into workspaces. It's been beat out of us to bring it in because we've been seen as weak when we do so. And I'm calling bullshit on it. I'm calling bullshit on it, and I'm saying this is the human body trying to give us signals, and you're cutting off 50% of the information or 75%. Like, I really believe that what's happening below the neck is so vitally important to understanding. And for us in the field of peace and conflict studies with the conflict onion, with the positions, people say, what are the positions? What you need to get at are the needs. And these involuntary bodily responses are deeply connected to what the needs of a situation might be. I'm going to give it another example in a moment that relates to that. But yeah, thank you, Paul, for bringing it up. And the receptivity of the space in which you bring it up is really important. And I hope, and I challenge each of you, that I can be a person who creates safe spaces for this type of information to be welcomed. And it's one piece of information, it's not the whole thing. But what if we invited this type of information into the space? Benny is also saying that I was picking up on the other person's lack of safety. Very, 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 very true. I could tell that person didn't feel safe. I was somehow triggering that person, or I think they saw, I don't know if I was a threat, I don't know what, but that person clearly didn't feel safe also. So there's a real lack of resonance there. A lot of it depends on the education of the people and said workspace to be able to understand this. Yeah, exactly. And it's hard, thank you, but it's hard to brainwash the body. And that's the word gaslighting was coming to mind for me, of like, I just stood in my truth and was like, if I tried to tell her the story of what was happening and my perspective on it, my thoughts on it, I feel like it can all be just written off so easily. I'm just going to stick to, this is how my body was reacting. And I know that at this institute, you'll understand that. And that's all. You do with that what you want. But this is, yeah, this is me being honest about what was coming up for me. The brain will tell you what your body needs. For sure, for sure. Wow. So you guys are at least a bit familiar with this way of thinking, and I'm really excited. The more this comes into our space as peace builders, I am just so excited about how I believe it will increase our effectiveness. Let me give you one more example, and then we're going to go on to another model that might be helpful. Here's an example of how it's playing out at the moment for me, with a particular person that I am super excited. So I run a series there's a small group of us. We're running a series of biweekly webinars for Ukrainian therapists, and we're bringing the somatic information to them. Every 2 weeks, we invite a different expert in to talk about some aspect of somatic therapy, and it's been super fun and really successful. We have we have like 900 and so people sign up for each one of these free webinars, and usually 500 come join us in the room live, and the rest watch the recordings. It's really cool. And we had someone come and speak, and I really loved what she was presenting, and we really connected, and we had some conversations in preparation for her talk, and the conversations were just going so well. There's lots of alignment, lots of jiving, and we both independently began to dream about what would it be like if we worked together. There's some events that we both were interested in planning. What if we worked together on them? And so we set up a phone call, and I remember the call so distinctly. I'm super into these walk and talks right now, or movement meetings. I've got the treadmill where I'm doing meetings while walking, or I'll take my cell phone, and I like to go up to the Arboretum, and I'm walking and talking with her and having this really productive conversation. And she pitched an idea and it triggered something in me, I guess, which I interpreted as wisdom. And I hope you can hear me okay, Paul. There's a huge noise passing by outside.
Can hear you great.
Okay, great.
Can't
Thanks.
even hear the noise.
Okay, so she pitched an idea and it triggered something in me, which I was like, oh, this is a really important insight I need. And I processed, and then I started to share. Well, I'm really concerned about what you just said because I saw it play out in this and this way in my last year of working on these issues and kind of sharing really fear-based like these concerns with her, blah, blah, blah. And I felt something in the conversation shift. I'm sure you've been in a meeting too, where something like the energy is so great and then something shifts. And that's okay. She is a somatic experiencing practitioner. She's a trauma therapist in this modality. She's a very wise, attuned person. And I heard both of us take a deep breath. And in somatic approaches to understanding the world, in the a deep breath is a trigger of the parasympathetic system. It's a way that we discharge. So I'm sure you experience this on a daily basis. My 5-year-old is taught this at school, right? If you're upset, take 3 deep breaths and count to 10. These are very specific triggers that are actually triggering that parasympathetic system. Did we look at this slide? I can't remember if I showed this one or not. Share. To help your system settle down again when there's been a little bit of a charge. So did I share this one? Yeah, we did this one. So on the left-hand side, the parasympathetic system. So I heard each of us take a deep breath as a way of counteracting this charge that come into the conversation, I think, and to try to like settle back down. And we took a pause, and she said, "What's coming up for you right now?" I was like, "What do you mean?" She said, "How are you feeling in your body at the moment?" Which this is so great in this community because this is how they talk. And I said, "My hands are sweaty. I can feel my heartbeat, but I also feel like open and curious. But there's a little bit of activation there, but I don't feel like, oh, but my mind is racing. Yeah, I have 100 thoughts flooding in right now. Huh. How are you feeling?" And she described how she was feeling, and it was similar. Of like there were some somatic signs of an activation having come into the space. And we sat with it for a minute, and we decided, you know what? What if we put our conversation on pause and honor that something has come up, but neither of us is quite sure what it is? And what if we just get out of our thinking brains about it and yeah, let's take a pause and step away and let's talk tomorrow. So we did that. I took the long way back to my car. I was at the Arboretum, and I remember walking the long way and doing heel to toe as I walked through the forest. I remember looking around and noticing all the different shades of green around me, very just like trying to hear, can I notice 5 distinct sounds in my environment, like really trying to get out of my head and into my body and not processing cognitively whatever that might have been, but really just stepping back and letting my body have the space it needed to process whatever this little charge. This is such a small example, right? But it was fascinating how it played out for me. So I didn't think about it anymore. I just walked, and I really channeled Thich Nhat Hanh and put all my attention on my mindfulness practices and noticed my breathing, and I went back to the car, and I came back and I did some work. And before I had to go pick my son up that day, I really wanted to send a short follow-up email. I told myself no more than 500 words. I gave myself a page count or a word count. It might have been, actually, that's a lot. It might have even been like 250. That just kind of does a little check-in for how I'm doing at the moment. And it was so interesting because when I went to write that to her, all this insight came that was really quite the opposite of what I had been thinking when the charge initially happened 3 or 4 hours earlier. And I had all this insight as I was typing that came around, wow, that is super connected to fears that I have about things, patterns that I've seen of how this has gone with other things, that my brain automatically jumped to what she was describing as the same as those, but actually it's similar. I can see why there's similarities, but the event she's proposing is actually different. And I have no idea what it is that she's proposing because my curiosity got completely shut down. I thought I knew, and it triggered all these fears about why that's a bad idea. So what I wrote to her was, I realized I have no idea the substance of what you were proposing, that my system shut down and I jumped to conclusions about what I thought you were proposing, and I jumped to conclusions about why that's a bad idea. I would really love to hear more about what you're thinking. And I shared some other things that came up for me that really surprised me, because earlier, 3 or 4 hours earlier, I thought I was all wise. And now I realized as I sat with this that I had no idea actually where she was at with this. So we've regrouped and she's been able to share her vision, and it so beautifully aligns with what I intuitively know in my body, in my mind body being, needs to happen in the world, but I hadn't had a vision for how that could be organized until I actually was able to listen to her. And for her, she said it was quite instructive too, because the fears that I was sharing, the concerns that I have are all legitimate. I've been more recently in this space of producing these types of events, and that was all really important information too. And again, I thought, what would happen? What would happen if, when in our planning sessions, something comes into the space like that, we're able to step back and to create space, to not try to think through it, to not try to whiteboard it, to get out the sticky notes and power our way through thoughts around it, but to let the wisdom of our bodies just kind of do its thing and to come back to it later. And I know you've experienced this in your personal life too. But I guess what I'd like to do is share curiosity with you around what would happen if we start to bring this into workspaces in a more concerted way. So again, I'd love to pause and just hear a bit about how what I'm sharing with you is landing, and any thoughts you have on what that might look like for you, either in the spaces where you're working now or in the type of spaces that you want to create to work in. How is what I'm sharing landing? And there's no right or wrong answers here. You can also say, this sounds like too much woo-woo, hokey pokey, this isn't going to work. I'm fine with that too. And there's no pressure. If there's no responses, that's fine too. But I just want to make sure I make space for you to kind of process and sit with that. You know what I had put in my notes and then I didn't do is to invite folks to, just before you answer, to take a minute to orient around your room, which is, you'll see this somatic community does a lot. So maybe you can take a moment. We can just, because it's just fun anyway, we'll just do this together, but just look around your room, turn around as far back as you can go. And as you're turning very slowly around your room, look for 5 blue objects and count them in your mind. And turn all the way back the other side. Let your body feel that nice twist. And then turn very slowly the other direction. Maybe you can count 5 things that are different textures. Hard to find different textures in an office. There we go. And now I'll ask the question again. What's coming up for you as you think about using these types of responses to somatic information in your workplace? It's good to understand that your mind and thought processes can be something that affects your body. That's interesting, huh? What do you guys think of this idea of creating space? We move at such a fast pace. We are waging peace. We have adopted militaristic language about our peace processes that implies a go, go, go pace and deadlines. And preconceived metrics of measurement. I have no idea. I know what the end state, if this colleague and I produce some things, I know what that end state looks like. I know what the type of events would be, but I have no idea the details of it. I don't know yet how we would measure success. And we would want to do rigorous studies around it. So we'd need to decide some of that in advance, but we would need to build in flexibility too, to be able to measure, to take in information and to do iterative cycles, perhaps, as new information is coming into the system of how things are changing. It feels very much about the process to me. And I know you've heard that before. It's about process, not the product. It's about the journey, not the destination. But I think for me, there's a new understanding around how to operationalize that coming into my approaches. I feel like creating space can help us catch up to ourselves. Oh, I would love for you to unmute and tell us more about that. Like our thought process to our brain. I'm just going to pause for a minute to see if you'd like to unmute to tell us more about that idea, but you don't have to. Creating space can separate you from the many deadlines that plague your life. Yeah. And give you permission with these deadlines to push them a bit. You all know this, right? We are part of a peace industry and what has become an industrialized process to peace. And I'm not dogging it, like I get it. But we need to deindustrialize the process in some ways, I think, and rehumanize it as we're doing that. That's like a dissertation level idea, though. How does identifying texture help us? That's a great question. Let me answer that, and then I'm going to read Nadine's comment more closely. So one of the things very quickly, and this is like the quick and dirty version, but one of the things when, we love to do these movements and they feel really great, but it's also really important for subconscious reasons to orient to your space, to notice what's happening around you in your space, because it tells your nervous system, I'm safe, which doesn't make any sense, right? Because you're safe. You like cognitively know that, but it sends subconscious cues, unconscious cues to your nervous system of I'm safe. So that's one reason why we orient in our spaces. And often in this therapeutic approach, in a therapy session or in a group session, you'll have folks like orient to your space and find something that brings you joy or makes you like you feel like good inside when you look at it, like maybe a plant or something that's a pretty color or a picture of someone you love. And then we bring the thinking brain back online with a little tiny puzzle. So find five things that are the same color, because your brain has to think a tiny little bit. Or five things that are different textures. You have to like work a little bit. Yeah, you're not just scanning, but you're like actively, your brain comes on, the thinking part of your brain then will connect a tiny bit to the limbic and the reptilian parts, if you will. Does that make sense? So it's just kind of a way of helping folks, first of all, feel safe and settled in their space. When I did the second round, when I came back around, I felt a really deep sigh come into my body, which again is like that parasympathetic, like, oh, okay, just moving slowly, orienting. And then I did an involuntary sigh. I didn't intend to. I thought, oh, that's nice. Like I'm getting back into my groove, into my rest and digest system, which is a much nicer place to teach from and to commune with others from, actually, than this heightened system. And for me, when I'm speaking, I'm Italian. I don't know if that has something to do with it. Like I go toward the more energetic side of things. So it's also why I like to just build breaks and pauses throughout to help. Like I want my teaching is always best when it's flowing from that more regulated space too. But to answer your question, a little exercise. Sometimes when we've got like 500 participants in a room and most have their Zoom cameras on, we will say, find 5 people whose name starts with the first letter of your name and say hi in the chat. or something like that. Or everybody whose name starts with M, raise your hand icon so we can see you. Just something little to like tickle the brain and to help connect the different parts. Nadine says this work can be framed within neuroscience and trauma-informed work. I work with the CA court system and family law and do a lot of work with court professionals and judges around these issues. They experience vicarious trauma. Yeah. And they want this type of training and education. It's so critical. So the institute where I was working last year and where I'm doing my training, Somatic Experiencing International, they're about to launch a new training program. It's a short course it's called Somatic Experiencing for Professionals. It's for lawyers, for police, for whoever, these judges and these types of folks, to help them begin to track what's happening in their system and also begin to track what's happening in other systems to perhaps better interpret what it is that is coming at you from another person, and to try to find resonance between those nervous systems. So just more texture in office spaces would create more of a sense of safety. Maybe, Paul, you guys can try it out at the Carter Center and tell us how it works. Okay, we've got 20 minutes left and I want to save a little bit of time for Q&A. I have all these examples that I've typed out here that we're not going to get to, but there's one more model that I'd like to share with you that comes from this world that I think might be really instructive and interesting for our peace and conflict world. So let me share. So we just did this. Go forward. SIBAM. So Peter Levine, that's the kind of developer of this approach, the somatic experiencing approach to trauma therapy, came up with a very simple 5-point model. And if you'd like to learn more, you can read about it in An Unspoken Voice or in his book, Trauma and Memory. Waking the Tiger is a really popular one, but SIBAM's not in it, I don't think anyway. And very simply, in trauma training, you spend lots and lots and lots of time going into this, but very simply, there are 5 channels that you can track in the human nervous system that are sharing information about what's happening in the world. So the first is sensation, and this is just to give you some ideas of what you can be tracking. The first is sensation. So any sensations in the body. I sense muscle tension, or I sense myself at ease. I sense myself sitting in the chair. My sit bones are really cushioned by the chair. I sense ease. I sense a knot in my stomach, or maybe you or the person that you're interacting with, they sense a real openness. They can kind of feel everything's moving really well. My arms feel heavy. My arms feel light. There's all different sensations. My hands are sweaty. My heart rate is up elevated, or it's nice and regulated. My breathing is shallow, or my breathing is deep. These are all cues, sensations in our bodies that can give us information about, is this person more in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic? Do they have their foot more on the gas pedal or more on the brake? Where are we as we're interacting with one another? Where am I as I'm interacting with this person? So one thing you can track are these types of body sensations. Another is image. This is really powerful in therapeutic spaces when you're doing like one-to-one therapy, but it even comes up in meetings. I've noticed. I love, and some cultures are better at this than others, but I remember one day I was in a taxi cab with the driver was from Africa, and I think we had just had some big election in the US, and I asked, what do you think, how are you feeling about the election results or whatever? And he got a big grin and he said, same cab, different driver. What a deeply powerful image that really taps into deep thoughts about what's happening in this space. And and when you're interacting with folks, you might hear just as they're talking in meetings, images come in, and you can really become curious about those images and what additional information might be there that gives us cues to what's happening, what can help us get beyond positions, interest, and down to the deep needs, etc. Behavior is one of the most informative that I find. in interacting in meeting settings and professional settings, because behavior has anything to do with the ways that this is manifesting in the external showing of the body, right? So facial gestures. If all you do in a meeting, if it's a group meeting and you can stay quiet and just track what's happening with people's facial gestures, what's happening on their face, are they like crunching up or their eyebrows, or are they pursing their lips? Are they, all these types of things? It becomes really informative. In our therapeutic sessions, we learn to track, you can track the heartbeat. If it's beating really fast, you can track it here. You can watch when people swallow. And often it will be linked to like things that they're thinking and feeling about what's happening that they might not even be aware of in the meeting. So there's a lot of behavioral cues that come out. It's also, you can see it in much more pronounced ways, like voices raising, people shouting. If you're in traffic and someone cuts you off and you shout and you slam your hand on the horn, those are sympathetic nervous system responses, often beyond your control, right? And it gives you cues to like, oh, my system is upset. You hear that happen even in our planning sessions. You can see versions of that. Affect is the emotional experiences of the system. So I'm feeling joyful, I'm feeling curious, I'm feeling irritated and shut down, I'm feeling very open. You can begin to track the feelings that are happening and then link them to sympathetic, parasympathetic, or to deeper knowledge about what's happening in the situation. And then meaning links back to our thoughts. Meaning kind of brings things together. And it's sadly, meaning is the channel that we spend 95% of our time in our planning sessions, but or in our partnership building efforts. But I think that there's 4 other channels where we could be tracking really interesting information. Let me share 2 closing thoughts in the next 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. I was talking with a somatic experiencing practitioner, a trauma therapist who's been working in Ukraine. She's from elsewhere, but she's been working in Ukraine since 2015 in the Donbas region until the full-scale invasion, and like many others has had to pull back now, but goes into the front lines often. She's amazing. And I'm leaving tomorrow for Ukraine, actually, and she and I will be together for 3 weeks. I'm super excited, working with her NGO Liberco, which is a human rights organization. She's amazing. I was talking with her 9 months after the full-scale invasion, and asked how things were going. And I brought to the space an assumption that she was going to be concerned, because 9 months in, if you remember, this is when donor fatigue sets in, and the CNN effect that had like brought all these people and all this attention to the space wears off, and CNN effect has, everybody's moved to somewhere else by now. And I was worried that they might be feeling a bit abandoned, a bit left behind, a bit concerned about resources for the future. And her response was, things are great, from a programming perspective. I was like, what? And she said, we're at the place now where the people who came here to work out their own activation have finally gone home or are leaving. And those who remain are working from a place of regulation. And I asked her to explain more. And it's a very somatic approach that she had to analyzing the situation. And what she said, my notes printed in yellow for this part. What she said was, if you're providing your aid or your humanitarian work out of your inner need to do something, so you have seen what's happening in the world, and your body very accurately, very appropriately experiences that sympathetic charge. I've got to do something. I've got to do something. This is totally normal. This is beautiful. This is part of who we are as a communal society. Yeah. Something happens and we feel a charge. And we often see that in, okay, well, this is when donations will start flooding in, where you have all these people volunteer. When the full-scale invasion happened, SEI, the Somatic Experiencing Institute that I worked for, they issued a call for volunteers and had, I don't even remember now, it was like 600 people sign up in the first 24 hours or something crazy, and didn't have the structures in place to support that and to be able to know what to do with all of those people. But this is the normal anticipated reaction that all of us, based on knowing how the human nervous system works, that we can anticipate this happening. And so she said, there's a lot of people that came over here with that activated charge, and it was a way for them to work out, to discharge that activation. It was actually about them needing to work out their inner need to do something. And once that's out of their system, they go home. And once the opportunity, but those of us who are those who are still here are working from a place of regulation. It's not from a place of this charge. It's from the rest and digest system. It's from a place of, like really being able to build sustainable things together. And the great thing about it is that I didn't feel any condemnation or judgment about that. She said, it's so important in our planning processes to have these contingency plans on the shelf. This is me adding, but the contingency plans on the shelf, to be thinking ahead of what are the structures that we will need in place to capture and to harness and to put to good use these sympathetic charges that naturally happen. Do we have the contingency plans on the shelf that we need to make the most of those sympathetic charges when they happen in the collective system? And then to put those individuals to best use. So she was talking with me about how structure is just so incredibly important so that we can most productively harness this sympathetic capacity that happens. But also it's really nice now, actually, to be coming back down into a space of a bit more regulation. I thought that was really instructive for the type of work that I want to do. And then looking at the clock, just very quickly, I'll share one more example of how this type of thinking helped me. When the sympathetic charge happened in our therapist community, one of the really beautiful creative ideas was one of the therapists who's an organizer in Hungary, which is right, a border country, and the refugees are flooding across the border, thought, what am I going to do? We've got all these therapists in our network here in Hungary. What can we do to help? And she thought, well, I'm connected to this whole group of therapists around the world. Let me see if any of them would be willing to, let me see if I can get an expert to come. I'll just plan a simple little webinar. Maybe I can have some therapists come to help hold space with us, maybe do some breakouts and see what happens. And there were, I think there were like 50 or 60 therapists from around the world within 12, 24 hours who signed up and wanted to be part of it. It was good for them. It was great for the Hungarians. She brought in a really beautiful speaker. They held 3 different sessions that did a very basic intro to this is your body on trauma, focused on our Hungarian colleagues and how they might be able to process all that was happening. Breakout rooms with therapists who allowed them to go deeper in thinking about these concepts together. And it was really cool. It was a really cool set of psychoeducation and sense of connection. But the takeaway for me that I wanted to share with you is that anytime that we can offer our more regulated nervous system to a space that has dysregulation or to a colleague that has dysregulation, it's incredible to watch what happens, because this stuck on high nervous system, when it comes into contact with a more regulated system, they can, but not always, they come into a resonance together because we're social creatures. And we are hardwired for cues. It's one reason why I love to have people have their cameras on when I'm presenting, so that I can we're constantly taking in that information together. So what she said to me, and I'll close with this, is this experience for Hungary and for the 4 neighboring countries of the world is there. This experience through doing this webinar together with folks from Brazil and the United States and Canada and Australia, all logging on to be part of holding space in those webinars. This experience for our team in Hungary and our 4 neighboring countries that participated, the sense of the world is there. We are there. We are not alone. It was deeply, deeply powerful, especially in those early days when we felt such a sense of overwhelm and uncertainty. This type of connection was so deeply supportive. And it really helped with helping to regulate the nervous systems and bring a more parasympathetic response online. You're not alone. We are here with you. Really beautiful, really powerful. And I think that that's another thing, that the more we understand the nervous system and how it operates, that we can bring into our space and peace building. So friends, those are some of my reflections as I've been hanging out in the intersection between peace and conflict studies and kind of the information coming from neurobiology and the trauma world recently. I would love to open the floor for the next 6 minutes to have you unmute. Paul's going to make it so that you can unmute and either share verbally or share in the chat questions you might have or what's been coming up for you as you've been listening. None. Any reflections to pass along, even if you don't have questions?
Actually, I had a question. Sorry, I was having a problem with my mic. I was just wondering how your time in Afghanistan influenced you to kind of join this field of like helping people out with their trauma.
Such a great question. And it's not in the ways I would have expected. Both my husband and I, so I met my husband in Afghanistan. He was the medic on the base. And like 4 or 5 years later, we got married. And both of us had this realization in the last 5 years that, oh crap, we've got like significant trauma issues in our own lives that we need help with. And it took us like a full year independent of each other. And on one date night, we both realized that we were having the same insights of it wasn't Afghanistan that caused this. Like that was my go-to. Like I just assumed for me, it was 15 years in the DC grind. For him, it was med school and all that entailed. But I think that the human nervous system is built for being able to survive. Like the most important function of our brain is to ensure our survival, and it will give you the information and the energy that you need to survive almost any situation. And so Afghanistan was really interesting. I mean, it was difficult, and there's a lot of residue that I'm still processing from that time and that our colleagues are still processing from that time. But for me, it informs my understanding of what I'm doing in the world now today, because it desensationalized it took what I thought was always something of those people over there, like those of us who have served. Everybody, I consider myself, I was a civilian, a combat civilian, with USAID and the State Department. Those of us who have served to be given PTSD diagnosis makes sense. And within our community, those who had single incident, an IED blast or whatever, that makes sense for them to get PTSD diagnoses. But the more that I dive into just understanding the basics of how the body works, I'm like, oh my word, this is so much more widespread. And that community has just had, or the people with those particular single incident traumatic events, or those who have lived in long-term horrific situations, abuse, et cetera, there's been more attention on understanding. That's kind of where the neurobiology has been unpacked and is being developed. But I think that small t trauma is rampant throughout humanity right now. I think the global pandemic unearthed a lot of for people how fragile our systems are and how important this is to our overall health. So oddly, my time in Afghanistan helped me to realize that it isn't just the big T trauma that falls into traditional categories that we need to pay attention to. It's the small t traumas too, and the everyday. So does that help answer the question?
Yeah, that's definitely a really interesting thought that I didn't give thought to before this presentation. So
Yeah. And that the tools for resolving, no matter where on the spectrum, if it's big T, small t, or whatever, the tools are the same. And these are actually, I believe, also the same tools that we need as peace builders to help build more peaceful societies in a sustainable way. And, oh, by the way, to have more peaceful relationships in our own lives, and to be doing this really difficult work on ourselves too, and in our own relationships, and then it spreads from there. So that's really how I got sucked into the trauma vortex. Was I think the application in the peace and conflict field is like, it changes everything for me. It's fascinating. So it's not just for the big T traumas. Thanks for the question. That was a great one. Any others? Well, Paul, thank you for hosting, for opening the space for us today. Thank you for those who have logged on. And I wish each of you all the best in your peace building efforts in the world. And I'll just close with putting on the screen my contact information. If you want to learn more about the SE Ukraine Task Force, I published an article on it, so you can find it there. You can screenshot that and go look it up. And then here's my Gmail and my Calendly link, so you're welcome to reach out anytime. And I'm always happy to vibe together on what I'm learning in this space and to learn from all of you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. This has been a fascinating discussion. My hope for everyone here and everyone in the world is that we can start to listen to ourselves and put aside the time to actually do this, and obviously to build more tools in learning how to listen and what to do with what we find. So thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.